With the rise of 3D graphics in the late 90s, developers around the world sought to deliver their own unique vision of what a 3D game could be, to varying degrees of success. Games such as Tomb Raider, Super Mario 64, and of course Quake stole the spotlight, but if you dig deeper, there's a lot of other games worth your time. Shadow Man is one such game, a dark action-adventure fusing platforming, puzzle-solving, exploration, and combat into one cohesive whole. Shadow Man saw a lot of success when it was released in 1999, but it's been largely forgotten over the years. Those that played it, though, have certainly not forgotten. And that's good news, because more than 2 decades after its release, Shadow Man has returned in remastered form thanks to the efforts of Nightdive Studios. So today, I'd like to revisit this curious gem of a game and discuss its creation, how it fares on original platforms, and what the remastered version brings to the table. We'll also walk through the game's editor to better understand how something like Shadow Man comes together. So close those blinds and join me in Deadside. Acclaim. In its early years, its reputation was perhaps less than stellar, with a slew of mediocre 8 and 16-bit games to its name. But that doesn't mean there was not an occasional hit, thanks to licensing. These hits include games such as Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam, among numerous others. The real shift, however, arrived alongside Nintendo's next-generation machine, the Nintendo 64. As part of the so-called Dream Team, Acclaim promised support for the system, and would wind up delivering a wide range of high-quality, internally developed titles, including the Turok series, Extreme G, and Forsaken, among several others. Acclaim saw a lot of success on N64, but also on other platforms including the PC, and it was in a good place during the late 90s. Now, during this time in the UK, after completing the sports game College Slam, Iguana Entertainment UK, which would become known as Acclaim Studios T-Side going forward, had an opportunity to tackle an original project themselves. In selecting this new game, the team perused the selection of comics Acclaim now owned after the acquisition of Valiant Comics in the mid-90s. This same strategy was already being used with the development of Turok Dinosaur Hunter, so it definitely makes sense to lean into this. In the end, they settled on Shadow Man. This dark, stylish design and mature themes seemingly appealed to the crew, and thus development got underway. Shadow Man first appeared in a run of comics dating back to 1994, but the game itself seems to draw inspiration from the second volume, which ran starting in 97. Following the next Shadow Man after 1994, Michael Leroy, the game would follow in the footsteps of the comic with its dark themes while delivering a large-scale action-adventure. So what is Shadow Man about anyways? Well, it's difficult to put a singular label on this one, but you could argue that it blends elements of games such as The Legend of Zelda, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, Tomb Raider, and more. You can run, jump, and Z-target enemies while exploring the environments. The game consists of exceptionally large, complex maps all linked together via different points. In that sense, it's a uniquely ambitious game for its time, with a non-linear structure that rewards and, in fact, often requires genuine exploration. By today's standards, the core mechanics are a little rough. Locking on and attacking enemies can be fiddly, and it's easy to die being sent back to an earlier point in whichever stage you failed on, but it's still uniquely satisfying to experience. In terms of overall design, progression is controlled by either your shadow level or specific powers you earn through play. For instance, you'll run into these gates throughout, the markings on which determine whether you can break the seal or not. This is determined by how many Dark Souls you've collected. Finding these souls is a huge part of the design and encourages you to explore and re-explore areas you may have visited, revealing new puzzles along the way. Other areas then are restricted by hazards that require a power-up, similar to a Metroid-style experience, I suppose. Early on, for instance, you'll gain the touch gads, as they're called, which allows you to shimmy across flame-kissed ledges. It's this learning of the world that becomes so satisfying here. You begin the game almost confused by the labyrinthian design while struggling to take out enemies with your default weapon. But after a few hours, you begin to understand the world design while becoming increasingly powerful. It encourages you to keep playing, and you'll slowly find your way to new areas before eventually making your way back to the world of the living to take out various serial killers. Yes, you're hunting serial killers in this game. Shadow Man was initially released for 3 platforms: Nintendo 64, Sony PlayStation, and the PC, with a 4th Sega Dreamcast version following later that year in 1999, which just happened to be the version of the game I purchased at the time. Obviously, the reason for doing this video right now comes down to the release of Shadow Man Remastered. This new version, of course, stays true to the original, but offers a whole host of new improvements. Later in this video, of course, we'll take a close look at how the remastered version stacks up against these original console and the original PC releases. The difference is, of course, rather staggering at times. But that doesn't mean these original versions aren't still worth exploring, which is what I'd like to do here first. Of the original versions released back in 1999, I think the PC version has the clear advantage here with its higher frame rate and support for 3D graphics cards of the era. For this video, I've captured the game running on a genuine Pentium 3 system featuring a 3DFX Voodoo 2 graphics card, and as you can see, it runs very well most of the time. The N64 version then is perhaps the one that caught the most attention at release, given that by 1999, the console itself had gained a reputation for being somewhat kiddie, as they say. Perhaps an undeserved label, but the M-rated Shadow Man certainly came at the right time, giving people the so-called mature experience they might have been searching for. This version takes advantage of the N64 expansion pack with support for a high-resolution interlaced mode, in addition to the standard 320 by 240 mode. The frame rate is not especially stable, but it's a cut above your average N64 game, especially Acclaim's own Turok 2 that had just released the prior year. It's perfectly playable. Impressively, the developers have managed to include all speech in this version of the game, while also retaining the memorable soundtrack.
Here, locked within a cankered cell, beset by madmen, chained to hell. And deeper still, a vast, dark love I find.
It looks and sounds absolutely spectacular for the N64. Now, the PlayStation version is widely considered the worst of the bunch, with the developers lamenting the fact that it wasn't really ready to ship, leading to slower performance than might have otherwise been achieved. I couldn't easily benchmark the N64 game due to noisy analog output, but thanks to the PS1 digital I'm using here, I managed to capture the frame rate on this version, and as you can see, it's atrocious. It usually averages between 10 to 15 frames per second. It's uncommonly choppy, even for the PlayStation era, and a huge step down from games such as Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. And then there's the Sega Dreamcast version. This was the final version to arrive, appearing on store shelves 3 months after the initial release. In terms of playability, this is technically the best of the 3 consoles, but it's ultimately one of the lesser conversions. It seems that the team simply converted the PC version to Dreamcast, but did a relatively poor job optimizing for Sega's new machine. As a result, the frame rate is highly erratic, swinging from 60 FPS at best into the mid-teens during certain sections. Beyond this, the audio is kinda broken. There's near constant audio glitches from music abruptly ending, like this, to sound effects that don't play properly. The whole thing just feels highly unfinished and unpolished, like the poor PC conversion it likely is. But now you're probably wondering, how do they actually stack up? This is where things get really interesting, and it becomes clear just how different most versions of the game are from one another. Textures and scene lighting all vary dramatically between the initial 3 versions, while the Dreamcast version closely matches that PC release, at least in most cases. Let's start with the cutscenes. This reveals just how much had to be changed for the game to run on the PlayStation. Darker colors and heavy dithering lend the game a unique appearance versus the other releases. It still manages to convey the overall story, I suppose, but it looks a lot better on the other platforms, I feel. Most shockingly, it's revealed early on that, on PlayStation, Michael Leroy is lacking his iconic spectacles. It's a baffling oversight, and if ever given the opportunity to discuss the game with its original developers, it will undoubtedly be the first question I ask. What happened to his glasses? When we get into the gameplay sequences though, I feel like N64 actually has a slight advantage. Look at this scene for instance. The distant buildings exhibit a strong silhouette on N64 against the sky, which is kinda ruined on PC and Dreamcast due to the way fog is applied to the foreground scenery but not the sky itself. It doesn't blend well. When we arrive at the boat cutscene then, typically you get this sequence showing this interdimensional canine sort of morphing before your eyes. Watch the PlayStation version though and note how that transformation is entirely absent. A sign of things to come. In general, the PlayStation and N64 versions have a slightly different tone compared to the super deep orange hue of the PC and Dreamcast versions. But the game is extremely grainy on Sony's machine and often really dark, making it difficult to really make out any detail in the scene. Now, let's jump to the chapel. Note how on PC and Dreamcast, both versions have this fake light shaft pouring into the room that's absent in the other versions. Keep this in mind for later, as it's something we'll see when we take a look at the level editor. Now, after this cutscene, we switch to Deadside, and check out this sequence and note how widely it varies per console. Once we arrive then, more differences are abound. The PS1 retains a stronger, punchier contrast, but appears just as grainy as always. Also note how the sky rendering varies between each of the four versions. On PC and Dreamcast, the game uses a pair of moving textured planes, along with a skybox featuring mountains. On N64, it's simply a spinning dome with a sky texture, while PS1 is just a static sky texture. Water rendering is also different between the consoles. N64 uses this flat scrolling texture. The PS1 uses a more complex mesh-based water, likely designed to minimize affine texture warping. PC uses a procedural water texture, while the Dreamcast version seems to use some other sort of animated texture. You've probably already noticed that PC and Dreamcast offer higher resolution textures compared to the other versions as well, but there's some variation in scene geometry, like this. But even more so in other areas. Note how in this scene, the PS1 version features fewer pools of blood to swim through, therefore simplifying the scene. This is something else you'll notice later on as well. This area on PC and Dreamcast, for instance, features a large pit in the center of the room. On N64 and PlayStation, however, it's a wide open flat space. Or this hallway, which features additional pipes on the wall here on these other versions, but not so much on N64 and PlayStation. Heck, it gets even worse on PlayStation when you arrive in the asylum. On every other version, this area features a huge wide open courtyard surrounding the building. On PlayStation, it's more constrained with these two large walls erected in what used to be an open area. Moments later, after you jump down to this pipe, you'll also notice this. On PC and Dreamcast, there's an alpha texture sort of wire mesh structure revealing the other side of this area, lending depth to the scene. On the other versions, N64 and PlayStation, this has been blocked off with a solid wall. Basically, while we've only examined the very beginning of the game, you should now have a good idea of kind of what to expect between the different versions. PlayStation is far and away the worst of the bunch, with a very low frame rate, ugly visuals, and major design changes to level geometry. Plus, Michael's missing his glasses. That's just not cool. While the N64 version is not especially smooth, I have a lot of love for it. It has a look I really enjoy, and it feels remarkably polished for the platform. Even the high resolution mode is reasonably smooth, a rare thing indeed. The Dreamcast version technically plays better, but it's glitchier overall and the frame rate is extremely variable. The PC version then is clearly the best of the four initial releases, even on vintage hardware, though I'd imagine a lower end PC like a Pentium 166, which is the minimum requirements, may not fare quite as well. Now, after this, Shadow Man sort of quietly faded away. Acclaim would release a sequel on the PlayStation 2, which isn't bad, but once they died off, the series took a trip to Deadside, where it would remain for quite some time. That is, until Nightdive Studios stepped in and resurrected it. And this is where Shadow Man Remastered enters the picture. Shadow Man Remastered, like other Nightdive releases before it, is a project designed to accurately recreate an original experience on modern hardware with new, modern visual features. Above all else, this is about ensuring that the original games can be enjoyed without the limitations of those original releases, and that's precisely what has been achieved here. This is a gorgeous remastering of the original game with a vast array of changes and improvements made to the underlying visuals. It features newly authored HD textures, support for high resolutions and ultra-wide displays, higher refresh rates, and a completely revamped remastered soundtrack. This new version utilizes version 3.13 of the Kex engine, bringing with it a wide range of new visual features. Lighting and shadow play a huge role in defining the look of this remaster, and according to Kex engine mastermind Samuel S.V. Kaiser Villarreal, the game now utilizes a clustered forward renderer, a technique that allows countless dynamic lights within a scene while still using a forward rendering path, which of course has its own benefits. It's possible to include a large number of shadow casting lights within each scene now. And console variables are available to examine this within the game itself. Colors here range from blue, which indicates no real dynamic lights, up to red where there are many. This visualization then showcases the Shadow Atlas used to store the shadow map data. And this is one of the biggest new features in the game. Any light with the correct designation can now cast shadows, including individual shots from your weapon. As shots penetrate the darkness, appropriate shadows now dance around the room beautifully. It makes for a much more dynamic looking game than was possible at the time. It also means that scenes like this, with these giant spotlights, now project actual light. This technique would of course have been impossible at the time. In the original games at best, you would have a somewhat faked shadow drawn below Shadow Man that doesn't always align very nicely with the environment. Another fantastic addition that was not possible are the inclusion of real-time physics. When you destroy objects or kill an enemy, the resulting pieces now have physics applied to them, which looks especially cool with the gibs that appear after vanquishing a foe. In the original game, this destruction seems to be a predefined animation. On the surface, it's a subtle difference, I suppose, but it helps create a more dynamic looking scene during actual gameplay. Another feature that's been added to the mix is of course screen space ambient occlusion. While there are many ways to handle AO in modern games, it certainly didn't exist back in 1999, so this is just another example of applying modern techniques to improve the overall fidelity of the world. So yeah, all these new techniques ultimately mean that it looks better than any prior version of the game. But bringing it back was no small task. To find out more, I spoke to Eric Serio from Nightdive Studios, who served as lead on this project, and he shared some insight into the process. So when it comes to the original version of the game, only the source code for the PlayStation version has survived. Naturally, this makes things a little more difficult, as it is the least optimal version of the game and exhibits a lot of platform-specific changes. Beyond this, Sam also took a crack at the PC version. He managed to reverse engineer the original PC version of the game, which would prove critical in this remastering process. All of the base assets then were directly pulled from that original PC retail release as well. So between the PS1 source code and the reverse engineering efforts, the team was able to begin rebuilding the game in the Kex engine. And there was a lot of work to be done. All the game data required manual work done through an editor, and more than that, content that had previously been cut was recreated based on whatever documentation they could dig up from the original project. So areas such as this, which didn't exist in the original game, are now included. Additional voice work that had been recorded back in the day but unused is included as well, not to mention new sound effects. Plus, as noted, the game's original composer, Tim Haywood, has remastered the original soundtrack. Now, one of the key components of the development process is, well, this. To work on the game, Eric crafted a special Shadow Man add-in for Blender, an open source 3D graphics toolset. Using 3D software like this makes a lot of sense, as apparently the original developers used 3D Studio Max to edit the maps in the first place. Now, Eric was nice enough to share this with us, allowing us to gain deeper insight into both the work that went into this new remaster and how the original game functions. So for this next part, and before we get to the actual comparisons, I'd like to walk you through some of these functions and share some of this insight into how the game actually works. So when you fire up Blender with the Shadow Man add-in installed, you have access to a new menu specific to the game files. You can choose from various maps included in the game, or simply import one of the models for editing. The model editor is extremely useful for examining and modifying these objects used by the game. It also gives us insight into the polygon budget the original artists had to work with. For instance, Shadow Man himself uses 584 triangles. This zombie enemy then uses just 312. Budgets were a lot different back then. One nice feature, however, especially for 1999, is that Shadow Man does use fully skinned models and features a skeleton system with weighting, an upgrade from Turok 2. It's possible to examine and edit the various animations as well, and Shadow Man has a lot of them. In the original game though, the animation playback was limited to 30 frames per second, but the remaster introduces interpolation to enable smoother animation. But what about the maps themselves? Well, let's start by opening the very first level in the game, the swamp. It begins with a cutscene, which just happens to take place in this sector right over here. But once this scene plays out, it drops you into the game world. One of the first interesting things, the boat here resting at the top, was rotated in the other versions, and this has been fixed in the remaster. Once you're handed control though, one of the first things you'll hear is this chime sound in the background. Very atmospheric, right? Well, how does it work? Simple. This yellow box represents a trigger to play back the desired sound. And this is basically how the soundtrack works in the game. While you're inside the specified box, it'll play the sound attached to that box. In this case, it's just chimes, but it could be any piece of music, really. Now, in front of the player, the designers have placed these actors, or birds, into the world. While playing the game, they fly around according to their behavioral properties. Of course, any actors placed into the world in the editor are shown in the default state, and like a 12-year-old, I can't help but giggle at these T-posing birds. Of course, while in object mode, we can place a cursor wherever we like to add another object to the world. So for instance, if I want to add a zombie dog, I simply click Add up here, choose from the Shadow Man object list, and select Actor. From there, I simply type in DOG to search for the different dog entities available, and select one. I can also add in a friend if we want. But okay, moving on. Check out these green blocks here. These are important. Essentially, this serves as a divider point between different sectors. You see, each map is comprised of a series of sectors. By splitting the map up into these smaller chunks, it reduces load on the system. So while playing the game, when you cross between these points, the game will load in the appropriate sector. There are ways to activate entities across sector barriers, of course, but by and large, you only ever really view one sector at a time during gameplay. The artists spent a lot of time designing each of these sectors to give the impression of a larger world, however. Case in point, the cathedral in this shot. It suggests a larger space with this distant scenery, right? Well, if you isolate this sector and get a closer view, you'll start to see that they used simplified geometry and textures created to be viewed from a great distance. It's nothing more than an artist's trick, but it looks great. But okay, let's rewind a second and talk about events using a very simple example. See this red area here below the ground? This denotes the placement of some sort of event. If you click on this, you'll notice that a sound file is attached to it. So, what does it say?
Damn.
Well said, Shadow Man. So what's the point of this? Well, it's a loose tutorial of sorts. Basically, this is the first point in the game where you learn how to jump. There's no punishment for falling into these pits, but Shadow Man will express his disapproval if you do. It's a simple but fun way to help the player understand what they're doing in these opening moments with the basic button presses. Moving on, let's take a look at this actor. What do these dots represent? Well, if we look at the name, it references flies. Switching to the game itself, you can see that, well, yes, it was pretty self-explanatory. Just another atmospheric thing that the developers can place into the levels. There are so many different objects that have been created, and many of them have different purposes with adjustable properties. As an aside, it should be noted that while using the editor in Blender, the high-res texture pack is not loaded, so we're looking at the original textures here, hence why it looks different from what you see while actually playing the game. If we move forward, this bridge is interesting. If you walk across it, the wooden planks fall. You need to jump over them to progress. So how does this simple object look in the editor? Well, firstly, these two actors were created to slot into this bridge here, and they're designed to fall if you touch it. Simple. But if you look at the rest of the bridge in this view, these are blacked out. So what's going on there? Well, according to Eric, the way in which movement works in Shadow Man means that the character model is somewhat sensitive to fine geometric undulations. He might even fall through the bridge slats. If we switch to editing mode and select the face of each surface then, check out the properties here. It's set to no draw. So we have this solid surface with collision that Shadow Man can smoothly traverse, but the player only sees the actual bridge mesh below it. Okay, got it so far? Let's move on. The next area features another large red volume which triggers an event, in this case a cutscene. In the game, when you enter this area, the camera cuts to this dog, plays a short animation, then returns control to the player. This event box simply triggers the sequence, the camera positioning, and the short quip from Shadow Man. This can be used to do many other more complex sequences throughout the game, of course, but this gives us an idea of how you might actually set that up. Once you gain control again, however, you must run forward and climb this ledge, another learning moment. Whether you can climb something or not is something you can determine by an attribute. If we select this face, for instance, and look over here, you'll note that hang is highlighted, noting that this ledge can be used for hanging within the game. This is how surfaces are defined by the game as something you can or cannot climb. As climbing plays a huge role in Shadow Man, this is used all over the game, and according to Eric, he had to manually correct a ton of ledges throughout the game to ensure that it works its best, since some minor ledges were not properly set up in the original game, potentially creating frustrating situations. Okay, but what about that dog? You know, the one from the cutscene. He's gone, right? Where did he go? Well, this is where we learn about these nodes. See this line? All of this is connected by nodes, which determine where the actor can move. In this case, the dog is allowed to travel along this specified path. As he's not an enemy you'll face in combat, however, this dog is a little different. Instead, a timer is placed on it. After the cutscene, he runs away following this path. The timer then counts down. Once it reaches 0, the dog disappears, which means Shadow Man never actually encounters it once you climb up there. Clever, yet simple. These nodes are important though, as it determines where enemies can move when you encounter them. Without navigation information such as this or a nav mesh, enemy AI wouldn't know where it could or could not move. This is very important for determining what your opponents can or cannot do within the game world. This is really just scratching the very surface of this topic though. Okay, moving on. Remember the ledge? That same technique can be used on things like this rope. The right attribute allows Shadow Man to climb across. The next thing I'd like to highlight then are these lights. Basically, the designer has the option to place lights within the map, in addition to the world light, which can be defined. When you place a light, you can determine the color and the type. The original game includes spotlights, flickering lights, and more, but Remastered adds 2 new key elements, per pixel lights and spot per pixel lights. Per pixel lighting operations were impossible on older hardware of the era. They instead relied on per vertex lights, but the new per pixel lights added to Remastered allow for much greater fidelity and lighting quality, but can also cast these beautiful dynamic shadows. Of course, as far as I can tell, there's no way to preview your lighting choices from within Blender, but there are additional tools they have available for checking this out within the game engine. Okay, moving on. We have another ledge defined as a hanging ledge before arriving at the chapel. One neat thing here, see this gravestone? The geometry here blocking off the stone looks ugly, but if you select the faces, you can see that it has a non-visible attribute with collision. This simply helps prevent players from getting stuck on more complex geometry without limiting the visual fidelity. Basically, it's a bounding box. Okay, next, let's move inside and check out these cool light shafts I mentioned earlier. Yep, it's just geometry, and with the alpha value set correctly, it appears beautifully transparent within the game. Naturally, collision is not calculated here, thus it becomes a perfect example of a fake light shaft. It's a good example of how artists used to need to think about things like this back in the day when it wasn't possible to calculate it using the more sophisticated methods we have today. Then just ahead we have another beautiful per pixel spotlight which has been placed to enhance the scene, and then we get into this cutscene, and that marks the end of the first stage. Now obviously, the stages after this become dramatically more complex, but hopefully this short tour through the very first stage of the game has demonstrated how some of the elements within the editor translate into the game itself. We're really only just scratching a fraction of what's possible here, but hopefully you get the idea. Now at this point we've examined the editor and discussed prior versions of the game and how they all stack up, but how does Remastered itself hold up when directly compared? Well, clearly the visual design is based directly on the original PC version, but while I do have a fondness for the N64 style visuals, this is probably the best choice. Overall world geometry is pretty much on par, but the new lighting features really increase the fidelity of everything you see. Beyond this, ambient occlusion is added to the mix, per pixel motion blur is an option, a high quality film grain can even be enabled as well. There's even a bokeh depth of field that appears when you use the item selection wheel, both of which are new to this version of Shadow Man. Now we've already discussed the lighting additions, and it cannot be understated how much per pixel lighting and shadow maps add to the scene. But the other major change stems from the new textures. Enabling HD textures, as they're called, allows for these new assets to load, and it looks really good. Look at this introduction sequence for instance. There is a lot of additional detail with this feature enabled, yet it doesn't actually look too out of place given the relative simplicity of the models. It's a difficult thing to get right. All of this extra detail is especially noticeable in this next scene as the camera pans up to this balcony. Also note the use of shadows in this sequence, it looks great. If we cut forward, however, it becomes even more evident during these various flyovers that occur when you first arrive at certain areas. The mix of per pixel lighting and higher resolution texture work really amps up the perception of detail despite the low poly nature of the world. You might also have noticed a boost in FOV. Remastered includes an FOV slider, allowing you to adjust this to your liking. Beyond this, the sky sees a nice boost with higher quality textures for both the skybox and the clouds themselves. Curiously, the clouds scroll in the opposite direction compared to the PC original. The procedural water texture also looks better in the remastered version. There's even a console variable you can use to sort of see how the ripple effect is done. Though if we dive into this pool of blood, it does highlight one area where the N64 fares especially well, and it really shouldn't be surprising. I'm talking about the distance fog. It's not used significantly when exploring the world, but when you dive underwater or into blood, you get this effect and it looks great. This was toned way down on PC and Dreamcast already, and it's even more so in the remastered version. There is still fog in certain areas of the game, but it's not really quite used in the same way as it was on N64. Still, despite things like this, I feel that overall rendering quality is boosted significantly in this remastered. Yet it still looks suitably 1999, which I think is a good thing in this case. Beyond the visuals then, the updated controls make a huge difference. It's now possible to more easily strafe and move around the world in a way that is not available in the original game. It's not a free camera system, mind you, but it's much more effective when it comes to dealing with enemies in tight quarters, something that was particularly frustrating in that original release. We've covered a lot of ground today in this video then, so what's the takeaway? Well, firstly, the remaster is a resounding success, I'd say. The restored content, audio-visual improvements, kex enhancements, and enhanced controls make for a better all-around experience. That said, the game design itself is still very much rooted in 1999, so it won't appeal to everyone. But give it a chance, and I think you might find a lot to love here. And after playing it myself, I'm reminded just how much I miss games like this. Shadow Man is not a big AAA release, and despite the marketing back in the day, it was not at the time either. Yet it felt like the development team was shooting for the stars here. It's unique, it's huge in scope, bewildering at times, but there's a lot of heart. Which is why I think it's still very much worth revisiting today. And obviously the remastered version is probably the best way to do that, though I did enjoy playing it back on N64 once again. Currently, the remastered release is available only on the PC, but console versions are coming soon enough. So whether you're a returning traveler or visiting for the first time, Deadside welcomes you back.